Israel and Palestine is the same place. It's one country. It's not at war. You don't have two armies fighting each other. In fact, there's never been a Palestinian army. I don't think there's ever been a Palestinian tank or an F-16. So it's not two nations at war that need help bringing about peace. It's a regime of oppression and colonization that needs to be transformed into a democracy with equal rights. So peace talks have got nothing to do with this, which is why they're not leading to anything. Because the peace talks are trying to solve a problem that doesn't exist. It's actually a complete diversion. People have a sense that in Europe, and the Europeans and the Americans are thinking, well, we're doing something. We have peace talks. We don't need peace talks. We need to change the oppressive, racist regimes that exist in Palestine today, just the way apartheid had to be removed from South Africa. And it's not nice to say, and it's not popular, but the reality is that today Zionism is the issue, just like apartheid was the issue in the 80s. In 1947, there were only about 500,000 Jews living in Palestine. The Palestinian population was close to 1.5 million. Yet when the United Nations decided to partition the land, if you can look at the map, they gave the larger portion, the kind of the bluish, greenish portion, to the Jewish community, and the smaller portion to the native Palestinian community. Now, first of all, who in the world is the United Nations to give out and slice out countries? But who thought this was going to work? In fact, all the way, even today, people say, you know, it's the Palestinians' fault. This whole conflict is the Palestinian fault because they refused the partition plan. Would anybody in their shoes not refuse it? Not that they were even asked. It's not like the Palestinians were asked and they said no. But I mean, who would accept such an absurd idea that a foreign power would take your country, take the larger portion, and give it to a small community of immigrants who really almost just came off the boat? The Palestinians, of course, call the War of 1948 the Nakba, the catastrophe. We, the Israelis, call it the War of Independence. That the catastrophe didn't happen in 1948, it began in 1948, 1947 actually. And it's a process that still goes on today. Perhaps even worse than it was in 1947-48. This is such a catastrophe, and what makes it worse is that we allow it to continue. This is happening under our watch. This is happening now every single day. Palestinians having to live like this only because the world chooses to support Israel. And nobody dares talk about this because this makes Israel look bad. And so I would encourage you to remind people that this is unjustifiable and inexcusable. And if this is the lesson of the Holocaust, then everybody's lost their mind completely. If there is a lesson of the Holocaust, is that this must never be allowed to happen. And it makes no difference if the children are Jewish or not Jewish or Christian or Muslim or whatever. This has to be the lesson. And sadly, I think the lesson hasn't been learned. And in 1948, and when I say Jerusalem, I don't mean the old city. I mean the neighborhoods, west of the old city, the new neighborhoods in what later became the Israeli side of Jerusalem. When the Zionist forces, they took those Palestinian neighborhoods that existed there, very well-to-do neighborhoods. They're still there, by the way. Only the people are gone. And the houses in these Palestinian neighborhoods were made available to Israeli families. And my mother was offered one of these homes. And the way she tells a story every single time since I was a child, and even when we talk about this today, is the exact same way. And the way she begins the story is, how could I possibly take the home of another mother? How could I possibly move into the home of another family that now has to live in exile? And then she would go on to describe the looting. Big trucks, military trucks, because these are well-to-do homes, and if you've been to Jerusalem, you may have seen them. Now, of course, most of them are boutiques and restaurants, but the houses are still there. So the furniture was stolen, and the rugs were stolen, and you may have seen there's an excellent documentary about the books that were stolen, rare manuscripts and books that were stolen. The Zionist forces were so organized that they even had a unit of librarians to go house by house and look for rare books that now sit in the in the library in the Hebrew University. So today, when people imagine that there could be an Israeli government, a Zionist government, that will allow the Palestinians to establish a state in that country, it's a complete misreading, it's a complete misinterpretation, it's a complete misunderstanding of Zionism and of Israel. There is no scenario, there is no possibility that an Israeli government will ever allow the Palestinians to establish a Palestinian state in what we consider as Israelis the land of Israel, which is the entire country. Palestine was crossed off the map, Israel took its place, and that's it. How we deal with the Palestinians, well, we figure this out day by day. There's not a family in the West Bank, and many of you have been there. I don't think there's a single family in the West Bank where somebody either isn't in jail now or was in jail at one point. They say the Palestinians are one of the most incarcerated people in the world, and none of it is for crime. It's all for resistance. Imagine the whites in South Africa. How many whites in South Africa do you think accepted, willingly wanted, were willing to fight for the end of the apartheid regime? Now, there were some, of course. We know that there were some whites who were part of the ANC and so on. But as a society, no privileged society ever welcomes or promotes the end of its privilege. That doesn't happen. It didn't happen in South Africa. It didn't happen in the United States with whites in the South. It's not going to happen in Israel either. It's not going to happen. So quantifying is quite, how many people share my views in Israel is quite easy because there are very few. And so a natural consequence of that is that people do not want to have this debate. People in Israel do not want to talk about the end of Zionism. They don't want to discuss a non-Zionist, not to mention an anti-Zionist narrative. Nobody wants to talk about it. Nobody wants to hear it. It is ignored largely. It is largely ignored, which is in many ways going to be their Achilles heel, I think. The fact that they ignore it. Because they pretend like it doesn't exist. So I don't see this coming as a result of the Israeli society one day waking up and seeing the glory of the Lord and peace and harmony. That's not how it happens. I do see it, though, happening as a result of pressure from the outside, boycotts, divestments, sanctions, hopefully pressure by European and other states who will realize that they're supporting the wrong side, that while they fought fascism and racism in their own countries, they're not supporting it in Palestine. And that's how these things happen. I mean, that is the nature of the nature of people. That is the nature of these processes. They don't come in necessarily because there's a transformation inside. They come in because there's pressure from the outside. And of course, there are always wonderful people on the inside in every society who see the injustice and fight it. And there are many wonderful Israelis who do a fabulous job in solidarity with the Palestinians, refusing to serve in the Israeli military and so forth. And of course, I have a great deal of respect for them. And sadly, I know most of them, which means there's not that many of them. If you criticize Israel, not to mention if you reject Zionism, then you must be anti-Semitic. So anti-Semitism means you're a racist, it means you hate Jews, it means perhaps you're a Nazi, that sort of thing. Which is a very interesting claim. But let's take it a step further. So what does it mean when you support the State of Israel? Because when you support the State of Israel, you're supporting a state that has laws that discriminate against the non-Jewish population. You're supporting a state that gives Palestinians about 1/10 of the water that Israelis get. You are supporting a state that has thousands of political prisoners who are Palestinians. You're supporting a state that on a regular basis for nearly 7 decades have been attacking and killing civilians. Palestinian civilians, in Palestine and later on in refugee camps in southern Lebanon and so on. So if opposing that is anti-Semitism, what is it called when you support this monstrosity? Are you enlightened? Are you a Jew lover? I mean, what does it mean? Are you some kind, I mean, how does it even make sense to say that criticizing this monstrosity, this brutal regime, is racist and anti-Semitic? Never mind the fact that you have Jewish people, almost every pro-Palestinian organization that I know has Jewish people who participate and support the Palestinians on campuses and peace justice groups and so on. Of course, they don't stand up with a big sign that say, I'm Jewish. They say, I'm a human being and I support justice in Palestine as well as other places. You know, so it is such an absurd claim. It is such a stupid claim. And it demonstrates one thing, one very important thing. They have nothing to say. The biggest problem Israel has is an issue of legitimacy, not security. Palestinians have never posed a security threat. Certainly today, Hamas in Gaza does not pose a security threat to Israel. They have no ability to answer to Israel's massive arms and big army. But Gaza, other refugee camps, the Palestinian cause, are a threat to the legitimacy of Israel, which is why they have to pull out the Holocaust and the anti-Semitism and the terrorism and the Islamophobism, every ism you want that can just possibly scare people. Because there is no way to legitimize Israel and no way to legitimize what Israel does. And I see this all the time. They're spending millions in America to combat BDS. They're spending millions to bring groups into the campuses and argue with the pro-Palestinians. And they come up with nothing. They come up with anti-Semitism. That's all they have. Is it still realistic to expect that Israel will allow a Palestinian state in the West Bank? I don't think so. I don't think anybody thinks so. I don't think anybody has a realistic expectation that there could be an agreement with the state of Israel that would allow the Palestinians a state in the West Bank and Gaza. Such an Israeli government that would allow that is in our imagination, maybe. There is no such animal. There is no such creature. There is no such thing alive today, and I suspect there never will be. Just look at how, even now, Israeli cabinet members are mocking Kerry. They call him names. They call him deranged messianic. They poke fun at him, and they say they can negotiate all day long. These are Israeli cabinet members saying, they can negotiate all day long. We are never going to allow the Palestinians a state. This is Zionism. I think the problem here is not the viability of the creation of a Palestinian state. The problem is understanding that Zionism is incompatible with peace and compromise, which is why we ended up not having a Palestinian state, even though there were opportunities in the beginning to bring about a peace based on a two-state solution, and Israel chose not to do this. And they succeeded. I think they succeeded. Do Palestinians have a right to self-determination? I think that's undoubtedly, the answer is yes. Is it realistic to expect that there will be a Palestinian state? I think the answer to that is no. Besides which, I think you'll agree with me that you cannot reduce Palestine to the West Bank. There's more than Palestine. Jaffa is Palestine. The Negev Desert is Palestine. They just tried to kick out tens of thousands of Palestinian Bedouins from the Negev Desert. I was there at the protests last summer. Everybody was carrying a Palestinian flag and wearing the whole map of Palestine. 25, 30 years ago, those very people called themselves Israeli Arabs. There's no such thing anymore. Palestinians are in the Negev, the Negev Desert. They're in Jerusalem. They're in the Muthalaf. They're in the Galilee. They're everywhere, including the West Bank and Gaza. So you can't really reduce Palestine, and I don't think I need to tell you this, of course, that you cannot reduce the Palestinian issue to the West Bank and Gaza, even if it was feasible. But I don't think it's feasible. It's not a question if Palestinians deserve it or if this would be the preferred solution. We have a reality that we have to live with. We're faced with a reality that was created by Israel, and that's just the way it is right now. So now I would say the realistic approach would say, okay, what is the next best idea? Which solution will serve the people who live there best? And then these are the options. What we have today is one option, and the transformation to democracy is another option. And I think it's time to make that very clear, that these are the choices. And yes, it means the end of the Jewish state. And yes, it means that we have to fight Zionism. And even here in Europe, with all the history and the Holocaust, we need to say these things. And of course, like you mentioned, the two things are not really connected, but they're presented that way. Israelis will not accept this willingly. like I said, no society that is, has ever accepted to relinquish its privileges. Israel will not do this willingly, but as a result of the pressure, as a result of the boycott, as a result of all of this, there will be an Israeli prime minister who, like de Klerk in South Africa, stood up one day and he said, Nelson Mandela will be released unconditionally. And everybody knew what that meant. It meant apartheid was on its way out. And I think there will be an Israeli prime minister who will say the prisoners will be released unconditionally, and free and fair elections, one person, one vote, will proceed to take place in the next, so many months. This is the process that has to take place. It's the only process that offers any kind of justice to the Palestinians, at the end of which, of course, the right of return will have to be discussed and other issues. But what I would say is this. First of all, bring back your ambassador from Tel Aviv. Send home the Israeli ambassador and stop all relations until all the Palestinian prisoners are freed and the Gaza and the siege on Gaza is lifted, and there's a date for free and fair elections with one person, one vote. Until then, there should be no connections with Israel, until these things take place. And I think that every Western country and every country that respects human rights needs to do this. These things should not be arguable. There's nothing to argue or negotiate. These are things that have to take place first thing.